My name is Carly Ellis, and I'm a member of the MPA Class 2018. Today I'll be playing host for this week's Policy Speaker Series, for which we are fortunate to have the Secretary of Cabinet and the head of the Ontario Public Service, Mr. Steve Orsini. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous territory on which we have the privilege of meeting today. The territory of Kingston has been the site of human occupation for thousands of years and is the homeland of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. We are grateful to the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island for welcoming us to their territory. Now I would like to introduce an accomplished member of the Ontario Public Service, Secretary Steve Orsini. Mr. Orsini is the Secretary of the Cabinet, Head of the Ontario Public Service, and Clerk of the Executive Council. Prior to his appointment to these esteemed positions, Secretary Orsini served as Deputy Minister of Finance and Secretary of the Treasury Board. Over his 27 years in the OPS, he has held executive leadership positions such as Deputy Minister of Revenue, Associate Deputy Minister, Office of Taxation, Agencies and Pensions, Assistant Deputy Minister, Office of the Budget and Taxation in the Ministry of Finance. I think we can say we were very fortunate to have him here today with us. Although Mr. Orsini has spent the majority of his career in the OPS, he also spent time in the Ontario Hospital Association, where he was Vice President of Policy and Public Affairs. We are all aware our world is changing, and the demands of public service and our government is changing with it. Actually, Mr. Orsini, the reform and evolution of public service was a key theme in our first management and public sector class that we all attended this week. We've all heard the buzzwords around service provision being more user-centered and more innovative to meet the ever-changing needs of the population of Ontario. Mr. Orsini is here today to discuss the path the OPS has taken as an organization to effectively meet these needs and evolve with the ever-changing environment. Mr. Orsini's talk today is sure to get us thinking and evoke many questions. As in the past, we'll be using Slido to pose our questions. For those unfamiliar, you can submit your questions by going to the Slido website directly or using the app on your phone. The code today is #MPA18. Please ask your questions throughout the talk, and please vote if you don't have any questions of your own. We will also take a few questions live from the audience. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Secretary Orsini.
Great, Carly. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be here today to speak to this group, because Queen's, I've always admired the university and the public policy school. So this is a huge opportunity for me to engage you directly. So I'm quite excited about today's event. I'm going to go through a series of slides, but I'm really looking forward to the dialogue, the questions and discussion, because I really learn. The best part of these events is hearing you directly, what's on your mind and your views. So there's three things I want to really cover here. And I just want, as part of a subnational jurisdiction in a global community, we can't be unaware of what's happening around the world. You know, Ontario's a big province. We play a role in the international community, supporting Canada. So how we think about international issues, how it affects our thinking is really important from my perspective. I want to talk a little about fiscal sustainability challenges. There's always going to be more needs and wants than the ability to meet in society. And that's about setting priorities. So I want to talk a bit about the overall fiscal climate and how moving forward government will be dealing with that. And then I want to talk about change. As Carly mentioned, about how we're going to take technology, what would the public service look like in the future as a result of that? So those are the three areas I want to cover. I always like to start off with what are the big challenges? And these are just terms. You know, I remember when I was Deputy of Finance, I used to have really complicated slides for that. And then when I went to Cabinet Office, they took those sharp instruments away from me. But I do have a number of slides because I think that shows some data, because I think you have to be rooted in evidence. You have to be rooted in facts and figures, so I do include a lot of those. But there's so many things happening around the world, and you have to think about what's your place in the world. And what role will you play in that world? And how will that world impact what you do? And it's the province is over 13 million people. There's over 64,000 public servants. And the question is, and we do so many different things that I need to spend time thinking about what are the impacts the world will have on us. So just going through fierce global competition. It's fierce, unrelenting. People will eat your lunch if you're not prepared to compete and always keep up. Even if you stand still, you'll lose. Even if you keep repeating what you're doing right, the chances of keeping ahead of the competition will slip. You always have to redouble your efforts to keep up with growing competition. How does that translate to NAFTA? How does that translate into our free trade agreements? Business investment is an important aspect. And that translates to what we do as a public service, how we regulate, how we deal with business, how long it takes to approve things has a small impact on a big issue. It's important for us to keep that in mind. You got demographics. We provide social services. We provide health care. If there's growing income inequality, if there's an aging population, we have to be mindful that that's going to put bigger demands on the services that we provide. If you look at technology and how fast that is changing, I'll spend a bit of time on how we see technology, how we see it changing and the impact on the public service. Urbanization. We are business, investment, job creation is always changing. We relied on the resource sector for many, many years. We're now relying more on the service sector. It's different location, different skill sets. How are we preparing ourselves for that? Climate change, and I'll come back to that. I won't get into North Korea and Trump. That's too cruel to inflict on you today. One thing I want to show, the 10 risks that the World Economic Forum has published. And I don't want to go through each one, but that is through their consultations with executives in Canada, leaders in Canada, saying, what do you think are the top 10 risks? And it's important to keep in mind what other people think the risks are. I might have my view what the risks are. Some of them are very important. So climate change, adaptation, unemployment, underemployment, failure of urban planning is one that just surfaced more recently, because we're seeing that in a world where we're urbanizing more and our ability to move people around in efficient ways is becoming more challenged. Hence, you hear a lot more of infrastructure spending on transit and the like to move goods and people around more effectively. So what other people are saying are risks are very important to keep mind now. Energy, because this is for Canada, and if you're in the Western provinces, obviously energy shocks. It has an impact on us, has an impact on the rest of the country. Cyber attacks. We were the first. There's another province that has a small role, but we're the first province that hired a provincial security advisor, just like the national security advisor. We're very worried about cyber attacks to our infrastructure, healthcare, our IT systems. And so we have a whole organization now built up to give us advice to keep on top of that issue, if you can keep on top of that issue. So I won't go through each one, but again, as the public service, we have to be mindful of the global winds that impact us and how we react and deal with them. So this is an international panel on climate change. I'm not a scientist. You in this room might have a much better sense of what climate change is and the impact it could have. There's enough scientists that are worried about it, therefore we should be worried about it. And the way I relate to it, if they said during the Ice Age, when the world was, when we had glaciers going all the way down to New York City, kilometers thick, and the world was 6 degrees cooler on average, and we're slipping into 1.5 degrees, and there's fear that we've already passed 2 by the time the world can react, it probably has bigger implications than we realize. The province has moved forward with carbon pricing. I won't get into details on that now, but we also are creating an Institute for Adaptation. We have to be able to model what the impact of extreme weather events will be on different parts of the province. And we're working with the insurance industry. So meeting with the private sector, they're very concerned. And we've been spending a lot of time with it because they bear those risks as insurers and reinsurers. And then you have Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England, looking at that we should evaluate companies based on whether or not their exposures to these risks. So these are things that, again, they're global, but they have a local impact. The other one, this is a chart from McKinsey. There's so many different ways to measure productivity. I like this one because it's purchase power parity. It takes out all the exchange rate differentials and says, our productivity relative to the US. We're constantly slipping further behind. It's less dramatic than some of the other charts, but it's widening. And for us to compete globally, improve our quality of life, our standard of living, really rests on our productivity. We've been able to improve productivity before with increased participation rates, people working harder, but now technology is going to be a key driver of productivity. And we have to think carefully of how do we continue to improve our productivity, which will advance us in our ability to compete with other jurisdictions. It's not necessarily doing things cheaper or faster, it's also commanding a better price for the inputs that we use to create a product, good, or service. The other one, I talked a little bit about income inequality, the Gini coefficient. So the more inefficient, the more inequity, the higher the Gini coefficient. I think, and this doesn't look at the 0.1%. You can get different patterns. But the thing is, you look at the after-tax income. And when I look at this, if it continues to widen, it's kind of flattened out, but the view is it will continue to grow. We can't use the tax system to always correct for market inequalities. Because I spent many years in the tax side and the Ministry of Finance, there's limited resources to try to counterbalance inequality. So the question is, what do we do? How do we make sure that people have the skills to be able to compete and command better incomes in the future, not rely on the tax system ex post to try to correct for income inequality, because there's only limited dollars that we have. We're doing a pilot, a basic income, to see whether or not giving people a reasonable level of income affects their ability to participation to the labor force. Does it free them up to spend more time educating themselves and training, which will help them over the longer term be more prosperous? So we're trying to learn through a pilot, a very elaborate pilot, of how basic income changes human behavior. You have many talking about we'll need a basic income in the future as technology starts to displace labor. I'm not a firm believer that's the case, but I wouldn't mind hearing from you as to how you see society changing with technology and how we should respond accordingly. The other one looks at longevity. We're going to have people living longer. If you're a pension plan, that's a concern. It's a good concern to have, but it's something that we have to think of the services we provide healthcare. And are we prepared to be, do we have the systems in place to be able to deliver all our healthcare services with an aging population that might have more complications? So how does that impact? We know, talking to pension plans, that their status of funding is constantly has to get reevaluated because of longevity, changes in longevity. And that has an impact to the amount that we have to pour into pension plans to make sure that they can meet their obligations that they've set out. This chart looks at disruptive technology. So those are the big risks. And one of the things that's both an opportunity and a potential risk is technology itself. Now this is some clip art, and the reason why I show this clip art is to prove to my IT department that when I Google this stuff, I'm actually working. But there's more to it than just that. If you look at the top row, social media, the second row is how we transact in society, and that second row is really transforming. The third row is even more dramatic. I'll take a quick quiz. How many here have heard of CRISPR-Cas9? Okay, so a number of you would have known. And what it is, I won't go into the science because I don't understand it, but it's ability to edit DNA, human DNA. They took it from bacteria that used it to snip DNA of viruses so they remember the bad viruses. But they took something that was in nature and they've been able to replicate it. And they've been able to now edit human DNA. They've done it removing some diseases, changing eye color. They're now really exploring this stuff. So that's a different type of healthcare. It's fundamental healthcare change. It's changing potentially the human species, which gets a little scarier. But it has huge upside. And it changes the cost structure of providing healthcare. And I have to tell you, we are still trying to figure out what this means. It's early enough. It's very early on. We don't know exactly its full application. But if you let your imagination wander a bit, it's huge. Did I just turn something off? Okay. If you don't like the slides, just tell me to stop. No, I'm only kidding. That's okay. You have a very subtle way to shut up a speaker. So let me talk about the other clip art, because I can remember this stuff, and I still have it in front of me. Artificial intelligence. It's emerging, it's changing. You read all the stuff. I won't go into the details, but we created, well, there's two things that we have to think about as a province, as a country, as a society. One is we have to embrace the technology. If we don't, someone will, and we'll only get the negative downsides, not the upside. So we created the Vector Institute. One of what they call the grandparents or godparent of AI is Jeff Hinton at U of T, who solved the ability to have these multi-layered neural nets. That's probably as far as I can explain it. But because he solved it mathematically, they've been able to have layer on layer and layer, and the ability for machine learning is growing exponentially. And so it can do you see it now, whether different things. I go into YouTube, it has nailed me perfectly. They know exactly, it's astronomy, it's disruptive technology, it's human genetics, all these topics. When I log in, they know exactly what the type of things, and they'll offer suggestions that I also like. So this technology is going to change. It's going to replace radiology. So there's a lot of talking to the former head of UHN, University Health Network. They think within a few years, the number of radiologists will go down. Their roles will change. They'll still play important roles, but a lot of this stuff will be done through imaging, AI recognition. They're now having legal work done through AI. There's a long list. I won't go through it, but that will be an impact. There's a futurist from Stanford that talks about two major disruptions. His name is Tony Seba. And again, these are someone forecasting change. What I like about his presentation, he puts his numbers out. He says, I could be wrong, but here's where I think the trend lines are for driverless cars and for energy. And if the efficiency of battery storage continues to improve, if the cost of solar power efficiency continues to improve, he says there's a point in time where that there's a risk people will be off the grid because you'll be able to have enough energy through solar power and storage that you'll rely less on the grid. So I'm thinking, okay, so let's say he's half right. Let's say it's not mid-2020s, it's later. We are spending $20 billion on nuclear refurbishment. We're building huge transition lines, and we're financing that through a global adjustment where the people don't like high electricity prices. And here's someone saying that within 10 years, a lot of that, there's a risk that the prices of the new stuff will be so cheap people will move off the grid. So as a public service or as a government, you start thinking, okay, what do we need to really do, think about, and say, what are the legacy assets in the province we may have? What are the legacy costs will the tax base will have to absorb? Because the rate base won't pick it up. I'm not saying this will happen. I'm just saying you have to step back and think about what's the potential. And driverless vehicles. His other theory is that the internal combustion engine ICE has about 8,000 moving parts. A electric vehicle has about 200 moving parts. That the mileage of an electrical vehicle will be increased to 1 million kilometers, and no one will drive 1 million kilometers. It'll be cheaper to ride share. That's his forecast in the mid-2020s. Now, is he right, is he wrong? The question is, big part of our economy is the auto sector. We're designed around the automobile. So we got to start asking ourselves questions on how does this technology will impact us. Even if you discount and say, well, that's way too fast, a lot of hype around technology, and you slow it down, then it's still coming faster than I think we're prepared for. So I want to talk about the speed of change. And this, you've probably heard of Singularity University. It's really a think tank, not a university, but there's some interesting speakers. I'm not saying they're 100% right, but they challenge our conventional thinking. And anyone that challenges our traditional way of looking at things, I get excited because I find that, you know, challenging our conventional thinking is always good and healthy debate. And so they show this line, they're showing all the exponential technologies. And you heard about Moore's Law. And they're saying Moore's Law is now infusing other sciences and disciplines where it doubles every 18 months, that the proficiency or cost efficiency, let's say, doubles every 18 months, that you get this exponential growth curve. But we look, as humans, we look at change on a linear pattern. Like it could be 5% improvement a year, 10% improvement a year, but not exponential. And what they're saying is these technologies here are now becoming exponential. That because the DNA is now sequenced, it's now digitized, it's now in the world of exponential change. Again, I'm not saying they're right. I'm saying they're challenging our conventional thinking. And if you look at the exponential graph or the linear graph, the analogy I was saying earlier today is that if you take 30 steps, you go 30 yards. If you double 30 times, so 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, you travel the circumference of the world 26 times. It's just that power of compounding. So if we're looking at the world as changing in a linear fashion, we might underestimate the speed at which change coming. And where that comes home to roost is we're talking to the auto companies, and they're looking at driverless vehicles. And so we're thinking, well, that's 20 years out. There's no way the stuff is going to be around that quickly. So they're now running driverless vehicles in some urban areas in the US with no drivers. They're test modes, they're still doing it. Our ability to accommodate a technology in society would be much more challenged. So just before Christmas, we posted our second regulation for consultations on driverless vehicles. And we moved from you have to have someone in the car at all times to under certain conditions where you meet a lot of rigorous tests, you don't need anyone in the car. And when we were the first jurisdiction in North America to have a reg that required at least a driver in the back seat. We found out that within 6 months there was 8 states ahead of us that had no driver at all. So it's moving from a regulatory environment. We're now competing to whether or not they can do research in Ontario. I mean, GM announced they're putting 1,000 AI or their researchers in Ontario because they thought Ontario, and they still do believe this, is the right place to put their technologists, because we have the right skill set, we have the right environment, but they said to us, you're already behind in your regulatory environment. So that's why it's moving a little faster than we think. But the huge opportunity, but our ability to understand it and our ability to absorb it and to embrace it will be challenged. So schools like public policy and Queen's or other faculties wrestling with these issues, it will be very helpful because no one has the answers for these. We got to make sure we ask the right questions. So then the question is, huge upside with technology, what are their downsides? Well, the one you hear often from Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking, and besides they talk about a basic income because of labor disruption, that you're going to replace big chunks of the labor market because they're going to be automated. Now, there's two schools of thought. One said, well, we've heard that. We brought in the automobile, and the horse and buggy industry was quite upset. And we saw how new jobs were created. They're saying we might be at a different venture now. So I'm not saying that that's true or not, but there will be displacement. The question is, what does society do to accommodate that displacement to the extent that it happens and how fast it happens? So there's two studies I'll quickly refer to. So this is done by Brookings Institute, which is Toronto-based. And they said they replicated a study that was done by McKinsey in the US and by Oxford Profs for the UK. And they said, we're just going to take their methodology and replicate it for Ontario. And they said, they looked at all the technologies and said, over the next 10 to 20 years, and they're guessing what the technology will be. So no one knows for sure, but they use McKinsey's research. And they said, of all these skills, what's the percent of the workforce that will be at risk of being automated over the next 10 or 20 years? And they said, by 10 to 20, 42% of the work tasks will be at risk. Now, some will be enhanced. You got better technology, you do your job better, but some might say we don't need that job anymore. And so I'm not commenting on exactly, I won't delve into the details, but there's the jobs that are dealing with more complex aspects of society are least disruptible by technology. The more routine, the more repetitive, the more at risk. The head of Google Brain says that if someone can make a decision in a second or two, it's most susceptible for AI. Because is that a dog or a cat? It takes a second. Someone will figure that they can automate it. A lot of things that we do in public policy are complex in society. How do you deal with homelessness? But we have to think about the type of jobs that will be impacted and what does that mean for the people that are impacted by it. And why do we care if it's 10 or 20 years from now? Well, it takes, how long does it take to educate someone? You're talking 10 to 20 years. And so we have to think about what's the education of today that will prepare someone for the future, even if it doesn't go as fast as some think it does. And so that's why you'll hear a lot more about the whole learning experience. That less about the facts, people need to know facts and figures, but more about how to learn, and there'll be more lifelong learning to constantly keep up with the changing technology. The next study looks at the occupation. So that one looked at tasks. This one's looked at the occupation. I'm not saying they're good studies or not. It's just illustrative that it has the potential for profound impacts. I'm quite struck by the occupations least susceptible to technology are psychiatrists and legislators. I'm not drawing any correlation between the two, especially the fact I'm being taped. But what I like about these studies, it gets you to think. It gets you to think, are we preparing ourselves for rapid change? Are we thinking about our future generations in a way that best positions them for an unknown world? So the next slide really speaks to that. So this was a study done by Brookfield again, asking 3 different groups of whether or not they're being prepared for the workplace through our educational system. It excludes Queens, I think. No, it's really asking in the generic form of all forms of education. But it said, they asked the education providers, are you preparing kids for the future of work? And 83% said yes. They asked the youth, 44 said yes, 44% said yes. And they asked employers, and 34% said yes. And one of the things, we've talked to a lot of high-tech companies, and Siemens really big on this. They have the German model, so they were here talking to us. And what they said is, we have great talent. But we need to really understand that we need to have complementary education or experiential learning in the workplace to really close any gaps that the system may not create. So I think that's where we're missed. Not that we don't have training people with the right skills. We're viewed as a highly skilled labor force when you compare us to other jurisdictions. Can we do better? Yes. Do we have the right skill sets? Are we training the right people in the right occupations? Maybe not, but it's not bad. But the question is, are we fully rounded to work in the workplace? And they're saying, no, we have to the employers have a role to play. And that's why with our highly skilled workforce strategy, we're saying we should look at ways to give people experiential learning to complement their learning in the school. And that's that's a good way to work with the business community, the educational institutions, and the students to figure out how best do we improve the learning experience. Not only when you graduate, but even after that, because the world will constantly change. So some of the skills that C.D. Howe came forward with, how do you adopt it? How do you be more resilient to technology? And they're talking about a lot of skills that I think, and certainly in a public policy school, that you are by design do. You're critical thinkers. You want to be innovative. You got to have intuition, philosophy, originality. These are important qualities to have because these are new territories we're venturing into. And having these questioning minds, people raising questions, looking at things differently is really a healthy part of public policy debate and discussion. I want to now shift focus to the sort of resources. This is my DNA coming out of finance. So I want to spend a bit of time talking about our fiscal environment, economic environment. And so the first thing I always like to show is our revenue is really dependent on the economy. I mean, that's not rocket science, but it does matter how the economy grows and where it grows. And so if you look at the past, we've had very, very robust growth rates, especially in the 90s where we had a competitive economy and low dollar. And so that really fueled significant economic growth. Then during the period from the 2000, the dollar reached parity and exceeded at some points, our economic growth rate fell. What we're looking in the future with our declining labor force growth rate, so we look at demographics, we look at global competition, and we find that our forecast, I'm not saying this is, absolute correct because it's a forecast, is that we see that our economic growth will be more modest, and that it's the big heydays may come for a short period of time. We just don't forecast, and we shouldn't plan on that because it may not happen. We have to be prudent in how we look at the future. And that's going to generate revenue, and that revenue funds our public services. So that's the backdrop, that we're going to see modest growth. It'll fluctuate, whether during the business cycle, but we see modest growth rates going in the future. So that means we have to think about, as a public service, we're going to have less, we won't have the big booms in resources to fund a lot of things. We're going to have to be really creative and innovative of meeting society needs with modest increases in growth. This next slide really looks at our contribution to the economy. And the reason why I like this slide is we've been in a stimulus mode for a long time as a province. Not only during the Great Recession, to quote Mark Carney, in 2009, 10, where we did a stimulus package and we ran deficits. So this is the net fiscal contribution. And I'll explain it technically, but we were pump priming the economy. And as you can see, it's only recently we started to pull back. And part of it is the stimulus stopped. We're now amortization from our capital investments picked up. Our interest on debts picked up. So amortization and interest on debt is not helping the economy, it's helping bondholders around the world, but not necessarily here. And as you can see, our infrastructure spending, which is the blue, is now not reaching our interest on debt and our amortization. So we're pulling back a bit, which is actually not a bad time to do it because we've been funding the economy. But notwithstanding that, our economic growth over that period of time has been modest. So we've been facing a structural change. And we've been relying too much on housing and domestic consumption. And we're going to need more on our exports and our business investment to ensure a more robust, and we're starting to see that. So I think from a contribution to our fiscal plan, we stepped in when we need to, and when we needed to, and now we have to see the economy take hold. Now stop there for a moment. We got NAFTA and U.S. tax reform that's now changed the landscape. Musings about pulling out of NAFTA and the recent package approved by the U.S. for tax reform has removed our tax advantage to comparable now, or maybe slightly less advantageous in certain areas of the economy. So we have to see how that plays out for business investment and our exports. So we're watching that very closely. Well, that comes to the government's fiscal plan. We show that again going back to 09, 010, very stimulus. Now we're pulling back a bit. So let's step back and say, how does our fiscal architecture in the country work? And so I want to show you a couple of slides here. So we look at our revenue to GDP. And it's an own source revenue. So we take out intergovernmental transfers. The feds give us money, we give the municipalities money, so we take out the intergovernmental transfers. This is own source revenue as a percent of GDP. As you can see, it's for local government, it's pretty flat. Your property taxes don't change whether there's big economic growth or not. It bounces around a bit. You look at the government, we are influenced by this business cycle, but now you have the federal government in Ontario pretty well neck and neck as a percent of GDP. Feds have come down a bit, and we've sort of up and down. It's maybe a slightly higher compared to the 80s. So when you look at this, you say from a revenue source, it's pretty stable. Yeah, it bounces around a bit, but it's pretty constant. But that masks some other fundamental structural issues in our spending, our revenue spending I want to now turn to. So this looks at net debt to GDP. So notwithstanding the federal government's revenue, own source revenue is pretty stable, ours is fairly stable, you can see that their fiscal position is dramatically improved. So their total, using a household analogy, their mortgage relative to their earning income has shrunk considerably, and our mortgage has grown relative to the income potential of the province. And so you figure, well, our revenues per GDP hasn't changed dramatically, but the underlying debt has changed dramatically, which getting the federal debt down is a good thing. I'm not saying that isn't. Ours going up may not be. It's a good thing during recessions. It's a good thing when you're investing in capital. It's not sustainable. And we're now leveling off, and now we're close to the federal government. We're not too far apart. And when you add those together, you're at 70%. The U.S. is at 80% net debt to GDP. Europe, some of them are above 100%. So we're still within, a healthy net debt to GDP, but there's always a concern of how big can that get. But again, their fiscal position's improved. Now you ask the federal parliamentary budget officer, what does the future hold? And what the parliamentary budget officer, who's independent of the federal government, says, well, we see the fiscal position of provinces deteriorating further. And we see that the fiscal position of the federal government improving. So you step back and say, okay, our revenues to GDP are the same, roughly. And so what's happening here? And so this next slide really explains that it's not the revenues per se, it's the spending responsibilities. Because if you look at provincial spending obligations, you got healthcare, it's an entitlement program. Education, for the most part, is entitlement. Elementary, secondary, and all that is entitlement. We need to finance our post-secondary education. That's our jobs. That's our economic base. It's one of our competitive advantages. And we have a lot of children in social services that are entitlement-based. So our expenditures are tied to demand and statutory, not to how much we decide to flow. So notwithstanding the federal government went out of its way to enhance the healthcare funding for provinces, you may recall some provinces were still concerned. They're not concerned that they weren't appreciative of what the federal government was doing, but they know the long-term trend for healthcare. And so that's why you'll always have federal-provincial discussions going on, and it's healthy discussion. And the underlying issue is not the revenue streams, it's the spending responsibilities. Or I should go back to that other slide. If you're talking to the federal government, don't show this slide. They don't like this slide because it'll never come true. They'll step in that we negotiate year to year. It's a trend line that won't happen. But what it does show you is the underlying forces. I presented this once to a group of federal officials, and I don't think they were amused. Again, it won't happen, but it's a trend. And so, same with spending. We can find new ways to deliver healthcare. Now we're going to take our spending with our demographics that are growing, a more aging, longer living society with disruptive technology. And somehow we have to figure out how can we harness that technology to deliver services more effectively. And that will be part of the task going forward. What I want to spend now is how we do public policy, and I think that's changing. There's a slide that was done by Accenture, sent me this, and they, 90% of the public, according to their stats, and again, these are illustrative, they're not precise. There's someone's, surveying people for their opinion, but I use it as a guidepost. So 90% believe the public sector should match the private sector in technology. And one of the challenges with that phenomenon is that the private sector only takes part of the market segment they like and they can make money off. It would be great if we only delivered services for youth and forget about seniors, counter services for seniors disabled. So we can't ignore all parts of society. So it's a bit of an unfair comparison where private sector can take a slice of the economy, give them great service, and ignore the rest. We have a broader obligation. So that's always a tough one in my mind. I think we have broader obligations that the private sector may not have, and that's why there's a public service. But the one I find really interesting is, yes, people want mobile access to mobile devices and all that, which we're moving in, is the bottom left, is that the vast majority of people want to actually be in the design of the programs that we deliver. Gone are the days where we're paternalistic and say, here's your program, you come and get it. During our time of business in this format, the world they want is, you're designing it around us when we need it, where we need it. And that's a healthy change. And so the question is, how do we change how we do public policy to reflect this new expectation in the public? And so that's really the next slide I want to talk to. And this is a slide I borrowed from the Chief Digital Officer for the UK. Now, we hired our own, but the UK, Tom Loosemore, was involved in creating the universal tax credit. Actually, he went in to correct what they did with creating the universal tax credit, because they approached it from the top row, not the bottom row. And the top row is you ask a group of doing public policy to solve a problem. I see this all the time, as Secretary of Cabinet submissions coming in. And there's a group that says, okay, we've been given a problem, whatever it is, we've thought about it, we talked to people, did some research, and here's a solution. And in the past, that might work very well. It doesn't work very well today. And the reason why it doesn't work